and the host of the Off Kilter Show and podcast. Her Twitter handle, Rebecca Vallas, REBECCAVALLAS, or at Off Kilter Show. Rebecca, it's great talking with you again. It's been quite a while. Tell us about the demand, I guess is the appropriate word, that if we're going to give a child credit, a break basically to young families who are raising children, that we're going to, I guess this isn't means testing, have a work requirement attached to it?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Tom. And it's a pleasure to be back on the show. And it has been a minute, although I feel like I've lost all sense of time in COVID. But you're exactly right. Here we are right now, 4 months into the expanded child tax credit, something that many of us have been calling a child allowance, which is akin to a policy that most other developed nations have. This is a policy that is estimated to cut child poverty in the U.S. by half in the next year, and it was one of the big and kind of most well-known parts of the American Rescue Plan Act that was signed into law in March of this year, expanding the child tax credit in really substantial ways. And we're in a place now where 4 months into this policy, we're seeing that kids and families' lives are already being dramatically changed for the better. Hunger cut by a third, according to census data that gives us a snapshot of what's going on with families. But now, in the context of a debate around whether and for how long to extend that expanded child allowance, because Biden signed into law an authorization for this policy to exist for just 1 year, now we're at a point where the senator from West Virginia, who I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with because he has been really standing in the way of a lot of Biden's agenda at this point in the context of what's called Build Back Better, Joe Manchin from West Virginia is single-handedly jeopardizing the future of that new child allowance by demanding that it include so-called work requirements as a condition for its extension beyond that first year. And we can get into why this is just a terrible idea, but it's unfortunately taking us back in time in some ways and rolling the clock back to what feels like a 1980s, 1990s era debate, and yet unfortunately playing out in 2021.
This is a game that conservatives have played with so-called entitlement programs forever. I mean, they're throughout my lifetime anyway, and that's a pretty long time. But certainly it really hit its stride in the 1980s with Reaganism. I mean, they tried to say Social Security should be means tested. Why are billionaires getting Social Security checks? The reason, of course, why is because if everybody's in, and it's less expensive to administer, frankly, and it works well, and I'm sure you have things to add to that why it's a good thing. But they keep and the strategy here, at least my understanding of it, and I'd love to get your take on this, Rebecca Vallas, is number one, turn it from essentially an entitlement, and I realize that's an old slur from the 80s, but I don't have a better word for it. Turn it from a program that everybody is eligible for into something that only people in a certain category, basically low income or, gee, they're working or whatever. But you convert it from a program, from a widespread program into a somewhat narrower program, and then you have the precedent set for chipping away at it, and now you can start to call it a welfare program, and pretty soon it's only available to people who are, in a very narrow spectrum, and then you make it harder and harder for them to sign up for it or get access to it. And we've seen this over and over again with everything from food stamp. I mean, it's just right across the board. Anything that is a benefit to people, this is their strategy. Do I have this right?
You've got it right, Thom, as you usually do, and I'll say that, of all of the different conservative strategies, right, which are not new. This is not a new idea, and we can talk about where it comes from. But all the conservative strategies out there over the years to shrink effective programs, to make programs really hard to access, and to demonize the people who turn to them. In many ways, the policy that is often called work requirements. I hate calling it that because it's really actually work reporting requirements. It's forced labor. There's a lot of different names for it. It's actually, in many ways, the most nefarious. So this is not a new idea. So-called work requirements, the policy of using survival benefits as a tool to compel paid and usually very low-wage, underpaid work outside the home. It's not a new idea. In fact, folks who listen to your show, watch your show, are probably very familiar that work reporting requirements were the centerpiece of Donald Trump's agenda to dismantle the safety net for the better part of his one-term presidency, including not only harsher limits on SNAP, food assistance for jobless workers, but also an immeasurably cruel policy that stripped health insurance away from unemployed workers through Medicaid. Both of those policies have thankfully been rolled back since by the courts and by the Biden administration. But you mentioned that there's a lot more history than even just what comes from the Trump era, and even a lot farther back than even Ronald Reagan's racist myth of the welfare queen.
So dig into
and
it.
in fact, a recent report from the Center for the Study of Social Policy is actually incredibly valuable on this. And we did a whole episode of Off Kilter, the podcast and radio show that I host about poverty, inequality, and everything they intersect with. We did a whole episode last week on this, the racist roots of work requirements. It was something of an open letter to Joe Manchin. The Center for the Study of Social Policy, who is featured in that episode, has documented in painstaking depth that work requirements have a long and assorted history in U.S. public policy. And in fact, they date all the way back to slavery. So let's be very clear here. Requiring people to work in exchange for basic supports it's founded on the idea that people don't want to work, and that therefore they need to be coerced to work by public policy. And this is an idea that is rooted in a very old racist myth that was originally developed by white enslavers to justify the forced labor of black people from Africa who were enslaved for white people to profit from. And so that's the original origins of work requirements in their most literal sense. But since the formal end of slavery, work requirements have consistently been used to coerce and to exploit and to devalue black people's labor. And that's, of course, despite the fact that black people have always participated in the U.S. labor force at high rates, and in many cases, especially in the case of black women, at higher rates than their white counterparts. But that's the long view history of this policy that we're talking about right now, and that we're unfortunately in the middle of yet another debate around. And while this moment is an opportunity to try to turn the page on that history, unfortunately, that senator from West Virginia is not interested in turning that page, it seems.
It's pretty mind-boggling. So the key to the whole thing, it's kind of like Hobbes versus Rousseau. It's like are we intrinsically good people or intrinsically evil people? Are we intrinsically people who like to have work and a mission and something to do all day, or are we people who just like to sit around on the couch and drink Jim Beam and watch soap operas and eat bonbons or something? Is there any research on what percentage of people actually don't want to work? I mean, the lazy few. I'm guessing it's probably between 1% and 3% of the population that are just like miswired somehow or traumatized or whatever. Setting aside people who are physically disabled, things like that.
Well, in fact, actually looking at the child tax credit in particular, which is where Joe Manchin is targeting his proposal, right? He's saying he wants to add these work reporting requirements to the child tax credit, a program that's about ensuring that all children have what it takes to thrive. It's not a program for forced labor for parents, but that's what he wants to turn it into. If you actually look at the child tax credit specifically, what you see is that according to the Treasury Department, 97% of families benefiting from the child tax credit in its current and expanded form are working either in some kind of job outside the home or in self-employment. And so 97%, right? That's where we are. And yet Joe Manchin's quote here, right, when he was initially saying that this was going to be his demand as a condition for allowing kids to continue to benefit from this incredibly important and successful policy, he said on CBS, on one of the Sunday shows, don't you think, I'm quoting here, don't you think if we're going to help the children that people should make some effort? And it's sort of mind-boggling when you think about that kind of a comment, given that it fundamentally devalues the unpaid work that parents do in raising and caring for their children. And this was a point that Senator Sherrod Brown, a longtime champion for the child tax credit, made when he was asked what he thought of Manchin's comments. Sherrod Brown said, well, I think raising children is work. And, the man's got a point.
Yeah, he absolutely does. And a good one, and one that needs to be echoed over and over and over again. Rebecca Vallas, Senior Fellow with the Century Foundation, tcf.org is the website. Twitter handle, Rebecca Vallas, Vallas, Rebecca, Vallas. Rebecca, thanks so much for dropping by. Oh, and the podcast, Off Kilter Show and podcast, available wherever fine podcasts are available, I'm assuming, Rebecca?
They are. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you get your pods, and